Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog. I recently made a point about national liberation that yes, Marx, Engels, Lenin were for national liberation, but not all the time. There was context to it. Engels famously criticized Kautsky for appealing to national liberation of Serbia as a reason to be neutral or back Germany's war effort, while Lenin said the liberation of Serbia would help either the Russian and thus the British Empire, or it would help Germany, and neither empire was worth helping. People often cite that letter, skipping that part, because the appeal to generic national development as a form of national liberation is often pulled from that letter without the second part, chastising Kautsky for cynically using national liberation to be more forgiving to the German war effort. Now, Kautsky himself was an opponent of the war, but didn't have the courage of his convictions and was unwilling to split with the even further right of the SPD, with Ebert and co. This is all well-documented history at this point, but you can go and look it up. I went through this theory of national liberation support in the 1920s and before. The theory was that if you supported national liberation, that once the imperial powers were not parasiting off these countries for additional profits and resources extraction and other forms of accumulation, that the national development would develop for a while and then turn on itself as the tensions between the local bourgeois and the local proletariat increased. Someone rightly pointed out to me that that theory has never been proven to be true. Now, you can't make a generalization about complicated social phenomenon based off of a few historical case examples, but they're right. Now, I don't know if they were trying to defend the national road to socialism or condemn the national road to socialism. I actually don't know what their motives were, and I'm not going to pretend to. But the problem is, particularly after the Sino-Soviet split broke up the communist bloc, most national liberation movements did not stay socialist. Some took longer than others to renounce it. I mean, Ethiopia, it was probably late 90s. Zimbabwe, it was later than that. And there are socialistic elements and people in socialist coalitions and broad popular fronts in some of these states, but they are not, nor do they claim to be, socialist states. And they often had to suppress their own internal socialist and communist movements, and many times their own workers' movement, to maintain the ability to get access to the world market. The countries that have maintained that have either liberalized towards the world market, China, Vietnam, or been shut out by other states. They didn't decouple, they were decoupled. The DPRK, Cuba. So ask yourself, what does that say about the national road to socialism? Is national liberation really about socialism? Now, it is about weakening the imperial bloc. And so in certain contexts, if it actually does that, would be worth supporting. Nor should we be supporting states that invade other states on a constant basis off of some half-ass revolutionary defeatist sphere, when literally the program is about consolidation of civilizational blocks, which is always, by the way, an imperial project. So think it through. Now, I'm not against national liberation movements. I don't take the hard council communist line on this, but I actually do not see the evidence that they, by and large, after the Sino-Soviet split, lead to anything like socialism, as these states cannot be autarchies. They cannot float their own currency. They do not have enough internal materials to do so, and would have to form coalitionary blocks with large states that did have those resources to be able to operate independently, meaning they can't operate independently. That is implicit in everyone's talk of multipolarity. Multipolarity is a reality. But there are reasons to support things, whether or not it would lead to socialism. Supporting the status quo or supporting other movements, supporting social patriotism, all of that also is irrelevant. Most communist movements do not have the manpower in the United States and North America to even marginally affect elections. Or to put it in another way, 1% of a population of 320 million, which is the population roughly of the United States, is itself more than 1 million people. In fact, it would be 3,200,000 people. To be frank, even at the height of the socialist movement in America, when the population was much lower, such as in 1919, when the population of the United States was 100 million, even the largest socialist parties barely reached 100,000. Which makes also all the debacles about the influence over electoral politics, whether or not you support Harris, Trump, or Cornel West or Jill Stein, somewhat irrelevant. You are not a major player in that coalition, nor have you built up a place to be. It would be hard to imagine how even the entire industrial sector could represent all of U.S. Political interest when the industrial sector itself only employs, including management, about 15% of the population, which is still several orders of magnitude larger than any socialist movement. So when you talk about the masses, it's a very different thing here than in Europe, where populist coalitions, where socialists were part, were able to make some headway, but then immediately fail. But in some ways, it makes the Bernie Sanders campaign all the more amazing that it got as far as it did. Amazing, yet also a waste, because it was a misrecognition of where the work needed to be. But also, it's hard to imagine to have enough people to have ever gotten to that point without that initial failure. The problem is we kept trying to do it over again. And even today, people still cry a bunch of tears about Corbyn and Bernie, as if that is particularly relevant. When people say Keir Starmer won with less support than Corbyn, which is true, but than Corbyn lost with, it's both true and also deeply embarrassing. Why did you lose if you had more support than people who could win? What does that say about the nature of the democracy, and what does that say about this world forward? See, most of this reeks of political fandom, which is a form of political hobbyism, an overinvestment in your political identity, as if your secretly held opinions and true beliefs were what the determiner of a general political future. And particularly when you can turn that into a brand and market it as a form of differentiation for attention online, this is a real fucking problem. But we also need to admit, there's no mass political movement that isn't online in America today. Who is not online? They might not be on Twitter, Twitter being the 18th largest social network, but they very much are online. All this stuff seems ephemeral because of the law of large numbers. It is hard to gauge where you're really at because from the leftist perspective, any organization with more than 5,000 people is historically massive. But from the standpoint of the general population of just the United States, it is not. So the national road to socialism and the electoral road to socialism both seem at minimum premature. See, there's a reason why a lot of the states that I mentioned that did maintain at least some nominal fidelity to socialism and are actually existing socialist states was that they existed before the USSR and PRC turned on each other. That's true for the DPRK. That's true for the beginnings of Vietnam. You know, North Vietnam's origins are way before that. That's true for Cuba. The African and Middle Eastern socialist experiments did not maintain that fidelity to socialism, and they had no larger network to join up with, and they had to play different networks off each other to be able to get good deals and resources to build up their national industrial profile once they were independent, which often required them to suppress proletarian movements. Study the history of Egypt or the history of Iran or what the Ayatollah did to the communists in the 80s. I mean, it's pretty obvious that that's what happened. Yet there are many people today who just want to wish that away. Pretend the Sino-Soviet split was just about Khrushchev being a bad dude. Pretend that Khrushchev being a bad dude was the only reason the Soviet Union fell. You can special plead all you want. And you look today to non-communist states as if they are inherently communist. But I find this ludicrous that people could say, well, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and national liberations don't turn on each other. Therefore, we should be class collaborationist. The thing that Marx and Engels cared probably the most about. Letter after letter after letter from Marx and Engels to Liebknecht and Bebel after 1860 were warning them not to enter governmental coalitions with bourgeois parties. Ironic considering how anarchists portrayed the dissent between Bakunin and Marx, because Marx's absolute maintenance on electoralism, which is true, he did. But the maintenance on electoralism had a hard out, which is you did not try to run with a capitalist government because you would get the egg on your face. Right now, we are so far away from that it is not even funny. And people who think that the state suppressing unions would be good for union development in the working class because it would sever the relationship to the state is very similar to third periodist arguments in Germany in 1932. And that's not because I think the MAGA group are all or even primarily fascist. I think that is largely a distraction from the problem. The tendencies that lead to fascism are the underbelly of a lot of liberal national development. Period. End of discussion. And I know that people don't like this because we also like to fight liberal cosmopolitanism, but nationalism is fundamentally the beginning of liberalism, as it was the beginning of capitalism. The polities before the development of liberalism in France and England, which came out of national consolidation projects, which were themselves imperial from smaller portions of those societies. That is what gave birth to liberalism for good and ill. as much as the Industrial Revolution is. Everybody can pretend, when the reality of interconnectivity means that things are weaker, that you can go it alone in the international stage as a nation, but pick some collective agency randomly to stop at. But the truth of interconnectivity was always not as good as you think, and yet always necessary. You cannot live your life without some dependence on someone else's labor, unless you wish to leave society altogether and hope to fend on your own. But what wilds are there for that? Where will you be allowed to be a mountain hermit? Furthermore, complaining about people being terminally online while also being terminally online is a way to avoid the fundamental question. Why is so much of the way socialists interact not based on the patterns of the economy? Outside of 2007, it's been largely responsive to the patterns of bourgeois politics. The economism and voluntarism have been around elections and bourgeois policy, which all depend on creating states of dependency on a state which the bourgeois largely controls. Most forms of politics in the United States, including radical politics, are methodologically nationalist and class collaborationist. Tote court. They're not even interested in building up the power that would need be to return to a workers' movement, or admitting that it's not possible. You have to do one or the other. To try to have it both ways is to fundamentally mislead yourself. Yes, Lenin, rightly, I think, supported national liberation, but it didn't go the way it was predicted to go. So why do you offer it as an answer to the creating a communist society today by itself? Why is your primary concern as a socialist foreign policy, which you have little means to affect? Not that foreign policy is not important, and I complained for years that no one paid attention to it. But now that it's a spectator sport in which people can project their hopes and whims and morality onto, I don't know if we were better before then. The question is, though, both are mistakes. Just like both economism, the idea that economic development will naturally lead to socialism, and voluntarism, that we can just wish things were another way, and it was our ideas that primarily matter. And by the way, all these key figure corrupted socialism ideas are actually forms of voluntarism, because the idea is if you just had a better leader, it would have been okay. It would not have likely been okay. Biographies and context are important, and leaders' decisions do matter. But why were the decisions constrained in the first place? Until you get that shit through your head, I don't think you should find politics in your life. I would rather you depoliticize. Go find a better hobby. Because treating politics as a hobby is depolitical anyway. It's just super dishonest about it. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, protect your peace. I'd like to thank Kano, Kahan, and Trey for supporting this video. Have a nice day.